So we've made it to the end of another month, and we're halfway through the year. So it's time to stop and rank all 10 June new releases that I saw from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I started this channel because I was driving everyone around me crazy talking about movies way too much. If you can relate, you're probably in the right place. Consider clicking that subscribe button. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all the June 2021 new releases that you saw, and let me know if there's any movies I missed that you think that I should check out. One more thing before we get started. There's a sale going on today in my merch store. You can get one of these I Talk Movies Way Too Much shirts for just $13. It's 35% off everything. You can get masks for under $10. Link is down below in the description, and let's get started. Coming in last place is Infinite. Now this one was a huge disappointment for me because I like this genre. It's like action, sci-fi, fantasy, all kind of blended together. I like the director, Antoine Fuqua, and it stars Mark Wahlberg, Dylan O'Brien, Chiwetel Ejiofor. It had everything going for it to be a movie designed for me, but the end result was a very derivative, mediocre film that was kind of all over the place.
Not impressed.
It felt a little bit like they took the Bourne Identity, Highlander, The Matrix, put them in a blender with a bunch of other things, mixed it all up, and just kind of spewed it onto the screen. The story feels like spread all over the place, like they heavily reworked the film in editing. Seems like they dramatically removed Dylan O'Brien's part from the film late in production. And so while there's some interesting ideas, none of it works nearly as well as it should. It's much better on paper than in execution. And it's a movie that I like this sort of thing, so it's watchable for me, but it's not particularly good. Number 9, The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard, the star-studded film that's all about a bunch of charismatic actors having a ton of fun on the big screen. There's not a lot of logic to the plot, but it is jam-packed with energy, one-liners, and over-the-top outrageous situations. When it comes to this film, though, it just didn't really come together for me. It was trying to do too many different things, and too many plot lines or jokes fell flat for me. In particular, what they did with Ryan Reynolds' character about he's going to therapy and he's trying to quit being a hitman, and there's like a Hitman award show and he's got daddy issues. It just didn't come together for me. Once again, I like this type of film. I like all the actors in the film, so it's entirely watchable. But for what it was going for, too much of it just fell more in the cringe category rather than working for me.
Some things should work, but do they?
It's interesting because much higher up on this list will be F9. Kind of similar films in that both of them kind of throw out all logic. Both of them are very much about charismatic lead actors doing ridiculous things. For me, F9 landed. It worked a lot better while having no logic to it. This one occasionally put a grin on my face, but not nearly as much. Next up, Spirit Untamed, the children's movie that's a follow-up to the movie Spirit that came out like 20 years ago from DreamWorks, though they're not really related on a plot level whatsoever. Just both of them involve a horse in some sense, but from there, they are dramatically different films. It was fine. It was a fun experience to take my whole family to go see it, including the baby. And there weren't many people in the theater, and the baby was inspired by the horse and started like galloping across all the seats, the recliners at the theater we were at. That was a lot of fun to see. The movie itself kind of pretty by the numbers. These types of films where you have a single parent, the dad that's trying to reconnect with his daughter, but there's some disconnect and miscommunications. She finds community through a horse. She gets swept up on an adventure. There have been a lot of stories like this done before, and it was a good enough one of those, very much aimed at kids. And so I watch children's movie largely in terms of like, okay, would I watch this on my own? This one, probably not. And then if my kids decided they wanted to rewatch this one a lot, would it drive me crazy? No, it wouldn't. And so it was a good enough film for children. Number 7, The Ice Road, the latest Liam Neeson thriller. In this one, he is an ice truck driver with a deadline trying to stop some miners from dying underground, and he's got to drive a bunch of pipes and other supplies across a bunch of miles of ice. And the thing about this one that was actually most interesting to me is that it was written and directed by Jonathan Hensley. Now, this is the guy that wrote and directed the Thomas Jane Punisher film back about 15 years ago. But even more so, he was a top screenwriter back in the 90s. And then for whatever reason, over the last 20 years, he hasn't done a lot of things. So it had my attention. The movie itself, it's okay. I think at the core of the movie, I think part of the problem is that it seemed like they had this premise of like, we need to do a story about ice truckers because it's wild that truck drivers drive on ice like this. And then they realized that it's just tough to build a story just around the conflicts related to that could carry a full runtime of a movie. Oops! And so then they had to incorporate a bunch of kind of the cliche not government, but corporate stuff and conspiracies. And so then they took kind of the thing that was most interesting about it, sidelined it for all the stuff that's very conventional. And so it was decent enough. I cared enough. I had fun enough with it, but it's also pretty forgettable. Then we have Batman The Long Halloween Part 1. This is the first half of an adaptation of the graphic novel of the same name. And the graphic novel, The Long Halloween, was one of the comic book runs that heavily influenced The Dark Knight, and finally they decided to do an adaptation of it. And when it comes to these DC animated movies, sometimes they do adaptations that heavily interpret the material, change things out, swap details, and fit it into their continuity. And other times they do ones that are like direct translations of the graphic novel into film form, as much as you can just directly translate it without adaptation. This is in that second category. It sticks very closely to the graphic novel, and that's a good thing. It's one of the best Batman graphic novels out there. One of my favorite Batman graphic novel of all time is Batman Year One, which obviously is kind of his first year. This is essentially the sequel to that. That means naturally I find this type of story very interesting. There's a couple oddities in the way that they directed it. A bunch of sequences are played out very slow in a way that just seem like they're awkward pauses. So it just makes the pacing a bit odd and the momentum of the story slower than it probably should be. But a solid DC animated movie based off one of the best Batman comic book stories of all time. If you're a big Batman fan, it's worth checking out. In 5th place, Luca, the latest Pixar film, is another solid entry into the Pixar filmography. It's a simple enough coming-of-age story about a friendship formed between two sea creatures that when they come to land, they appear as humans, and then they go into town and enjoy life. It's very optimistic. It's very much about children being children, becoming friends with one another, and trying to discover who they are. So it's just a charming little story. Might not carry the weight of a bunch of the other Pixar films, but not every Pixar movie needs to be swinging for the fences and hit a home run. This one's going for a single and a double, then it got a single or a double. It's a solid, charming film. Certainly not one of my favorite Pixar films, but a good one. In 4th place is In the Heights. Now, I am definitely not the target audience member for In the Heights. That would be my wife, who watched it the night that it debuted on HBO Max, and then last week she went to go see it with one of her friends in the theater, and then as soon as she got home from the theater from watching In the Heights, she put In the Heights on HBO Max.
No way!
I'm not the biggest musical fan, but even I got kind of swept up with the characters, the optimism, the music, the musical numbers. It was a lot of fun, and I think most of that boils down to the fact that these characters feel relatable. They have conflicts, struggles, obstacles in the way of what they're working towards, but they're not cynical. And so then it's a story that just feels uplifting as this community bands together to try and help one another succeed in all these different areas, all while having a bunch of catchy songs, memorable dance numbers, a bunch of things that pop. Not really my thing necessarily. I'm not going to rewatch it like my wife does, but one that put a smile on my face when I did watch it. Real quick, before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what was your ranking of the June 2021 movies that you saw, and did I miss something that I need to check out? Also, remember, there is a sale going on in my merch store where you can get these I Talk Movies Too Much t-shirts for just $13 or masks for under $10. The sale ends, I believe, at the end of the day. And third place is F9. Now, this movie is proudly ridiculous. It wears its lack of logic or believability on its shoulders and proudly puts it on display to the degree that characters in the movie literally stop and talk about how they should be dead and how everything they're doing is not remotely based in actual physics. And for me, this bizarre formula still works. This is my Sharknado. I don't like the Sharknado movies. They're too dumb for me. But this dumb franchise that is totally lacking any logic, I'm still having a fun time with. When it pauses to do exposition and give backstories and explain what everyone's been up to and do all the soap opera and melodrama, didn't care all that much for that stuff. But both times that I've seen this movie in the theater, it put a huge grin on my face. All the ridiculous shenanigans, I was absolutely eating it up. This is absolutely not cinema, as Martin Scorsese would say. Here I am. But it is great entertainment for me. This is why I call them Taco Bell movies. It is not fine cinema. It is not fine dining, but I love to eat it up. Our runner-up, Fatherhood, the new Kevin Hart dramedy on Netflix, where Kevin Hart is essentially a single parent and you watch him working through single fatherhood as his daughter gets older. And it's just especially as a parent, a movie that, really tugs on the heartstrings while having humor that's not big setup punchline type stuff, very relatable scenarios that any parent has been involved in, or if you've babysat kids, been around kids at all too much, you've been around these types of scenarios. So it finds little moments of humor while also just kind of dragging through the reality of tragedy, the heartbreak of the difficult choices you have to make as a parent, the awkward situations that come up, the uncertainty, kind of touches on all of that stuff that every parent has to deal with. Learning to let go without letting go too much, learning the right amount to be protective without being overprotective. It's at its core touching on the most relatable aspects of all of this. It's sentimental. It's all of that stuff. It didn't come to necessarily as emotionally satisfying of a conclusion as I would have hoped, given how emotional the first half of the film was. Felt like they kind of had to contrive a little bit, a series of scenarios to create something to overcome rather than fully having an arc that I thought was satisfying with the lead character and bringing him to a place of change that was for the better. But overall, a very solid dramedy. But in first place, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. As a point of reference, this movie isn't even in my top 10 for the year. And so this wasn't a month that had particularly high highs. The lows were pretty low with Infinite. The highs were like, yeah, these are good. I really enjoy these movies, but they're not in that great category. For me, I thought this was another solid entry in the Conjuring franchise. I thoroughly enjoyed going out on another adventure with the Warrens, where this formula was chained up just a little bit, where it's more of an investigation, little courtroom aspects into it. There's some human bad actors in the mix that the Warrens have to work against. All those slight changes to the formula was what I thought exactly what they needed to kind of tell another story in this world, keep things interesting. This is a movie that it's a lot of people seem a little bit more lukewarm on it than I was, which is I'm a little bit interested by, because I got what I wanted out of it. I think some people are saying it's not as scary as the other movies. I don't get scared by movies, so that doesn't really factor into my rating of horror movies. I just don't get scared by films to even notice the difference. I got what I wanted out of this movie, so for me, this one comes in at number 1, while once again, still not being in my top 10 for the year or anything like that. Remember, if you want one of these shirts, the link is down below in the description. I'll try and pin a comment to all of my reviews for each of these movies if you want to hear my extended thoughts on any of them. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.